The floorboards of the Halen River trading post were stained with more than mud and spilled ale. They held the ghosts of old bargains, the sweat of trappers, and the dark, sticky residue of cured tobacco leaves. It was a place of noise, of haggling and boasting and the clink of coin on wood, but Rena Doss moved through it as a creature of silence. Her silence was a cloak, woven tight. Men's eyes would snag on the scar that silvered the skin from her jaw to her collarbone, a clean, deliberate line like a river carved on a map of pain. They would look, then look away, granting her the quiet she demanded without knowing they'd been commanded. She came for salt, for steel traps, for flour, never for company. Her cabin had no name on its door because it had no door that welcomed visitors, only a heavy plank of ironwood she'd hewn herself, secured with a bar of hammered steel. It stood 3 days' walk from the post, nestled in a fold of the Spineback Mountains, where the wind spoke in a language older than men. Today, she'd brought down a bale of prime ermine pelts, their winter coats thick and white as new snow. She'd traded them for a season's worth of necessities, without speaking more than 5 words. Her list was finished. Her pack was heavy on her shoulders. It was time to return to the hush of the trees. But something held her, a stillness in a place that was never still. It wasn't the quiet of peace, it was the quiet of neglect. Between a stack of tobacco crates leaking their sweet, cloying scent and a pile of grimy feed sacks, something lay curled. At first, it looked like a bundle of discarded rags, another piece of refuse on a floor that was nothing but. But the rags had a shape. The shape had a tremor. Rena's eyes, the color of wet stone, narrowed. She saw a tangle of dark hair matted with something sticky. A small hand, fingers curled tight, tucked under a cheekbone. The thin cotton of a shift, torn at the shoulder, revealing skin mapped with the purple and yellow of old bruises. A child. A girl, maybe 6 or 7 winters old, though it was hard to tell. She was famine-thin, a bird with a broken wing, tucked into the shadows to die. The traders and trappers moved around the space, their heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. They stepped over her, around her, their gazes sliding past as if she were a knot in the wood. They saw. Of course they saw. They were men of the wild. They missed nothing that moved or breathed. But this child was not a prize pelt or a sack of grain. She was a problem. She was a mouth to feed with no coin to pay for it. And so, by the unspoken law of places like this, she did not exist. To look was to acknowledge. To acknowledge was to be responsible. Rena stood as still as a heron hunting, her gaze fixed on the small, curled form. The air was thick with the smells of men and goods, smoke, leather, grease, damp wool. Underneath it all, Rena could smell the faint, sour scent of fear coming off the child. She watched a beetle crawl slowly up the side of a crate, its journey an epic across a wooden world. No one spoke to her. No one approached the girl. An hour could have passed, or a minute. In the world Rena inhabited, time was measured in heartbeats and the turning of the sun, not the frantic noise of men. Her pack settled on her shoulders, a familiar weight. Her supplies were secured. The mountains were waiting. Her cabin, with its single chair and its cold hearth, was her sanctuary. She had built a life from the remnants of another, a life of clean edges and hard truths. There was no room in it for anything fragile. There was no room for another heartbeat. She took a step toward the door. The floorboard groaned. The sound, small as it was, made the child flinch. A shudder ran through the tiny body. It was the only sign, apart from the shallow rise and fall of her chest, that she was alive at all. The flinch was not of a child startled from sleep. It was the flinch of a rabbit hearing the snap of a twig, the instinct of a creature that knew pain, came from sudden movements and loud noises. Rena stopped. The cold, sharp thing inside her that had kept her alive, that had guided her hand as she'd stitched her own skin back together by the light of a sputtering tallow lamp, shifted. It was a feeling she knew well. It was the feeling of seeing a trap, its steel jaws waiting, and knowing you had to walk toward it. She unslung her pack and set it carefully on the floor. Her movements were fluid, economical, not a whisper of wasted energy. She walked toward the crates, her soft-soled boots making no sound. The men at the counter fell silent, their conversations faltering. They watched her now. The woman with the scar was doing something, and when the woman with the scar did something, you watched. She knelt. The floor was cold through the thick hide of her trousers. She was close enough now to see the chapped lips, the faint blue veins under the translucent skin of the child's eyelids. There was a cut on her forehead, scabbed over. Her breathing was a dry, rasping whisper. Dehydration, starvation, the slow, quiet shutting down of a body that had been given nothing to run on. Rena didn't touch her. Not yet. She simply knelt, her shadow falling over the girl, a sudden eclipse. She was half shadow, all silence, a piece of the mountain come down into the grubby world of men. The child did not stir. From a pouch at her belt, Rena drew a small water skin, the one she kept for herself, filled with clean, cold water from her well. She unscrewed the wooden stopper. The scent of the water, pure and clean, cut through the stale air. She moistened the corner of her own rough-spun sleeve and reached out. Her hand was steady, her fingers long and calloused but deft. She gently, so gently, touched the damp cloth to the child's cracked lips. The girl's eyes fluttered open. They were not the eyes of a child. They were old, ancient, full of a deep, weary nothingness. They were dark, the color of peat-rich soil, and for a moment they held no fear, only a profound exhaustion. Then, as they focused on Rena's face, on the scar that pulled one side of her mouth into a permanent, unsmiling line, a flicker of terror returned. The child tried to press herself further into the floor, to become smaller, to vanish. Rena did not pull back. She held the cloth to the girl's lips, her expression unchanging. She was not offering comfort. She was offering water. It was a fact, not a kindness. The girl's lips parted instinctively, a primal need overriding the fear. She tasted the water. A small, guttural sound escaped her throat, a noise of pure want. Rena tipped the water skin, letting a few drops fall directly onto her tongue. The girl swallowed, a painful, convulsive movement in her thin throat. Then she coughed, a dry, rattling sound that shook her entire frame. Rena waited for the coughing to subside. She looked up from the child, her gaze sweeping over the silent, watching men. Her eyes were chips of flint. One of the traders, a portly man named Balin, whose face was a web of broken veins, cleared his throat. "She ain't with anyone, Rena," he said, his voice greasy with false sympathy. "Been there since sunup. Some scow hands on a grain barge left her. Said she wasn't worth her feed." Rena's gaze lingered on him, cold and flat. She said nothing. The silence stretched, becoming its own judgment. Balin shifted his weight, his bluster deflating. She looked back at the girl. The child's eyes were closed again, but her breathing was a fraction less shallow. She had swallowed the water. She had chosen to live for one more minute. Rena Doss had made a choice once, long ago. She had chosen to live when dying would have been easier. She had clawed her way out of a life that was meant to be her grave, and she had walked into the wilderness to build a fortress of solitude. She had learned the hard currency of survival. You take what you need, you protect what you have, and you owe nothing to anyone. This child, discarded, deemed worthless, left to die on a floor sticky with contempt. Rena felt that old, cold thing inside her, the core of her strength, solidify into a single point of fierce, unyielding resolve. It was not pity. Pity was a weakness, a luxury she'd burned out of herself years ago. It was not charity. Charity was for people who had something to spare. It was recognition. She saw the child, and in the bruised, abandoned flesh, she saw a reflection of a truth she knew in her bones. The world broke things. It was the nature of the world. You either stayed broken, or you took the pieces and built a weapon. She slid one arm, strong and wiry, under the girl's thin shoulders and the other under her knees. The child weighed almost nothing, a bundle of twigs and air. As Rena lifted her, the girl's head lolled back, and a small, whimpering sound escaped her lips. It was the first sound she'd made, a thin thread of noise in the heavy silence. She smelled of dust and fear and something sour, like spoiled milk. Her body was limp, with a trust that wasn't trust at all, but the complete surrender of a creature that has no fight left. Rena stood up, holding the child against her chest. The girl's dirty hair was pressed against the rough wool of her tunic. The slight weight was alien, yet strangely correct. She held her as she would hold a rescued fawn, with a firmness that was both possessive and protective. She looked at the watching men one last time. Her face was granite. The scar was a livid declaration. This was her territory now. This small life was under her claim. Her lips, the ones that rarely formed words, parted. The whisper was not meant for them, but it carried in the unnatural quiet of the room. It was a rasp of sound, rough as bark. Mine. She turned, her back to the gaping faces, and walked toward the door. She didn't retrieve her pack. Balin or one of the others would bring it out. They would do it because they were afraid of her, and her claiming of the child had made her even more unpredictable, more dangerous in their eyes. She pushed the heavy door open with her shoulder and stepped out into the sharp, clean air of the mountains. The sun was beginning its long slide toward the jagged peaks of the Spinebacks. The 3-day walk home had just begun, and she now carried a future she hadn't known she was looking for. The child was a stone dropped into the still, cold pool of her life, and Rena knew, with absolute certainty, that the ripples would change everything. The walk was a meditation in endurance. The child, cradled in one arm, slept the deep, exhausted sleep of the near-dead. With her free hand, Rena steadied herself on the treacherous paths, her senses alive to the world around her. She was not just walking. She was reading the story of the forest. The snap of a twig to her left was a squirrel, not a wolf. The sound too light, the ensuing silence too brief. The configuration of clouds over the western ridge meant a cold front would move in by morning. The scent of crushed pine needles under her boots was a constant, clean perfume. She stopped only once, as dusk began to bleed purple and orange through the canopy. She found a sheltered overhang of rock, moss-covered and damp. She laid the girl down on a bed of dry pine needles she scraped together, pulling a thick wool blanket from her pack, which one of the postboys had indeed run out and left for her, his eyes wide with fear and awe. The child didn't wake. Her skin was still fever-hot. Rena built a small, smokeless fire, with the practiced ease of a lifetime spent in the wild. She shaved dry tinder from the heart of a fallen birch, struck a spark from flint and steel, and nurtured the flame with patient breaths. She filled her small cook-pot with water from her skin and added a pinch of dried oat groats and some crushed yarrow for the fever. While it simmered, she took a clean rag and gently washed the girl's face. The grime came away to reveal delicate features, sharp with hunger, but finely made. The bruises stood out starkly against the pale skin. Under the matted hair, the cut on her forehead was shallow, already beginning to heal. When the gruel was a thin, warm paste, she woke the child. The girl's eyes opened, still fogged with sleep and sickness. The fear was there, a reflexive tightening of her small body. Rena ignored it. She held a spoonful of the warm liquid to the girl's lips. "Eat," she said. The word was not a request. It was a statement of fact, like breathe or live. The girl hesitated, her dark eyes fixed on Rena's face. She looked from Rena's stone-gray eyes to the livid scar. Rena didn't smile, didn't soften her expression. She simply held the spoon steady. Finally, the girl's lips parted, and she accepted the food. She swallowed, then accepted another spoonful, and another. She ate until the pot was empty, her movements slow and deliberate. When she was done, she lay back down without a sound and was asleep again in moments. Rena sat by the fire, watching her. The flames cast flickering shadows against the rock face. The wilderness was alive with the noises of the night, the hoot of a distant owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind in the high branches. For the first time in years, she was not alone in it. The small, breathing body by the fire was an anchor, a new gravity in her solitary universe. She felt a strange, fierce hum under her ribs, a feeling she hadn't had since before the scar, before the world had burned her down to the foundation. It was the feeling of having something to protect, something that was hers. They reached the cabin late on the third day. It was less a cabin and more a part of the mountain that had been given walls and a roof. Built of dark, weathered ironwood and stone, it was banked with earth on two sides, making it nearly invisible from a distance. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Rena had banked the fire before she left, and a bed of coals still glowed in the hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and the cold, clean scent of the coming night. She pushed the heavy door open and carried the child inside. The interior was a single room, sparse and ruthlessly organized. A narrow cot was built into one wall. A stone hearth dominated another. A heavy wooden table and a single chair stood in the center. On shelves carved into the stone wall were neatly stacked jars of preserves, dried herbs, and bundled roots. Tools hung from pegs, knives of all sizes, an axe, a hand adze, all clean and sharp. It was a space that tolerated no clutter, no sentiment. It was a workshop for the business of living. The child was awake now, her fever having broken during the second night. She was weak but aware. She looked around the small cabin, her eyes wide. She took in the sharp, clean lines of the room, the lack of any softness, save for the pile of furs on the cot. Rena set her down on her own 2 feet. The girl swayed, her legs unsteady. She looked up at Rena, a silent question in her eyes. What now? Where am I? Rena didn't answer with words. She pointed to the cot. The girl understood. She scrambled onto it, pulling the furs around her, her smallness swallowed by their bulk. Rena turned to the hearth, adding fresh logs to the coals. Fire caught, and a warm, golden light filled the room, pushing back the encroaching twilight. She moved around the cabin with her usual efficiency, unpacking her supplies, putting everything in its designated place. Salt in the stone crock, flour in the sealed tin, new traps on their pegs. The girl watched her every move. She watched how Rena's hands, though calloused, were precise. She watched how her body moved without hesitation, a study in purpose. She saw a woman who was as much a part of this wild place as the rocks and the trees. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated not by conversation, but by shared tasks and silent observation. Rena never asked the girl her name. Names were for the world of men, for claims and ownership and histories. Here, in this cabin, you were what you did. So Rena called her, in her own mind, Anin, an old word from a language almost forgotten, meaning breath. Because that was what the child had been when she found her, a fragile, fading breath. Rena taught Anin not with lessons, but with actions. She would go to the snare lines in the morning, and Anin would follow. Rena would show her how to read the tracks in the dirt, how to see the subtle signs of a rabbit's passage. She would show her how to reset a trap, her fingers moving with deft certainty, and Anin's dark eyes would follow every motion, memorizing, learning. She showed her which roots were for eating and which were for poison, crushing the leaves in her palm so Anin could learn their scent. She showed her how to stitch a tear in a tunic, with small, even stitches that were nearly invisible. She taught her how to bank the fire, how to read the weather in the wind, how to be silent and listen to the language of the forest. Anin, for her part, was a quick study. She was a child of silence herself, her past having beaten the words out of her. She learned to communicate with Rena through a language of gestures and shared glances. A tilt of her head was a question. A hand on Rena's sleeve was a request for help. She learned that the slight tightening around Rena's eyes meant a storm was coming, that a certain stillness in her posture meant a deer was nearby. She never spoke. Rena did not press her. Words were cheap. Words could lie. The scar on Rena's face was a testament to the violence that could be wrapped in pretty words. Here, truth was in the heft of an axe, the warmth of a fire, the taste of fresh-baked bread. The girl began to heal. The bruises faded from her skin. The hollows in her cheeks filled out. Her hair, washed in the cold, clear water from the stream and combed by Rena's patient fingers, grew thick and glossy dark. The haunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She was still a timid creature, but there was a new resilience in her, a strength forged in the crucible of Rena's silent care. Rena found a tenderness growing in her that was sharp and painful, like a new tooth breaking through the gum. It was a possessive, feral thing. When Anin would press herself against Rena's side for warmth by the fire, Rena would not put her arm around her, but she would let her stay, her own body rigid, a bulwark against the cold. When she caught a rare glimpse of Anin smiling at a chickadee landing on the windowsill, the feeling in her chest was so fierce it almost hurt. This was hers. This small, growing life was a thing she had claimed from the refuse of the world, and she would protect it with the same cold, hard fury she used to protect herself. One winter, when the snows were deep and the world outside the cabin was a sea of white, Anin fell sick with a lung fever. Her breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps. Rena didn't sleep for 4 days. She brewed foul-smelling teas from lungwort and pine sap. She packed the girl's chest with hot compresses of mullein leaves. She sat by the cot, a sentinel in the dim light, listening to every painful breath, her face carved from stone. In the deepest part of the night, when the fever was at its worst and Anin was muttering in a delirious sleep, Rena found herself stroking the girl's damp hair back from her forehead. It was an unconscious gesture, an instinct that bypassed the walls she had built around her heart. When she realized what she was doing, she snatched her hand back as if burned. But she did not leave the cot. She stayed, a silent, unyielding presence, willing the fever to break. And it did. On the 5th morning, Anin woke, her eyes clear, her breathing quiet and even. She looked at Rena, and for the first time, she reached out her small hand and laid it on the scar on Rena's face. Her touch was feather-light, full of a child's simple curiosity. Rena flinched, a violent, involuntary jerk, but she didn't pull away. She forced herself to stay still as the small fingers traced the raised silvery line from her jaw to her collarbone. Anin's eyes were not filled with horror or pity. They were filled with a deep, knowing sadness that was far too old for her years. In that moment, a new, unspoken understanding passed between them. Anin knew that the scar was a part of Rena, just as her own faded bruises were a part of her. They were both survivors. They wore the maps of their pasts on their skin. Years passed. The seasons turned, each marked by the rituals of survival. The spring thaw and the first shoots of wild onion. The summer, with its long days of foraging and preserving. The autumn, with the hunt for meat to last the winter. The deep, silent cold of winter itself. Anin grew from a waif into a slender, strong girl, her movements as sure and quiet in the forest as Rena's own. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of a shared history, a deep and abiding connection that needed no words to sustain it. Anine was no longer just a breath. She was the steady beat of a second heart in the quiet cabin. She was perhaps 13 or 14 winters old, her body just beginning to hint at the woman she would become when she found the locket. It was a day in late autumn. The air was crisp, and the leaves of the aspens were a shower of gold. Rena was down by the stream, cleaning a pair of rabbits for their supper. She had sent Annin to the small, hidden root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin to fetch a jar of pickled beets. The cellar was cool and dark, smelling of damp earth and stored provisions. Annin knew its layout by heart, but today, as she reached for the beets on the top shelf, her fingers brushed against a loose stone in the wall. Curiosity, a trait that had been slowly awakening in her, made her pause. She pushed at the stone. It shifted, then came free in her hand. Behind it was a small, dark hollow, and inside the hollow, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a small, flat object. Annin's heart began to beat a little faster. This was a secret, and in their life of stark, open honesty, a secret was a strange and powerful thing. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that this did not belong to the life they shared. It belonged to the time before, the time of the scar. Her fingers, nimble from years of weaving snares and stitching hides, unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside lay a locket. It was made of silver, tarnished with age, with a simple, unadorned surface. It was cool and heavy in her palm. With a trembling thumb, she found the clasp and pressed it. The locket sprang open. On one side was a miniature painting of a woman. She was beautiful, with hair the color of fire and a smile that seemed to light up the tiny space. Her eyes were a shade of green Anine had never seen before. It was not Rena. This woman was soft, where Rena was hard. She was smiling, and Annin had never seen Rena truly smile. On the other side was a painting of a man. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way. He had dark hair, like Annin's own, and eyes so dark they were almost black. His jaw was strong, his mouth set in a confident, almost arrogant line. There was a power in his face, a certainty that the world belonged to him. Annin stared at the image, a strange feeling stirring in her chest, a cold dread mixed with a faint, ghostly sense of recognition. She had never seen this man before, and yet. She looked closer. There was something about the set of his eyes, the shape of his mouth. She held the locket up, her own reflection captured faintly on its polished surface. The man's eyes were her eyes. The dark, straight line of his brows was her own. The blood drained from her face. This man. This was the man who had given Rena her scar. The thought came to her with the force of a physical blow, an instinct so deep and sure it could not be questioned. This locket, hidden away in the dark, was the source of the pain that had shaped the woman who had saved her, and the face of that pain looked back at her with her own eyes. She quickly wrapped the locket back in its oilcloth, pushed it into the hollow, and slid the stone back into place. Her hands were shaking. She grabbed the jar of beets and hurried back out into the bright, cold sunlight, blinking like an owl flushed from its roost. The world looked different now. The golden leaves seemed too bright, the blue of the sky too sharp. Everything was overlaid with the image of the man in the locket. When she handed the jar to Rena, she couldn't meet her eyes. Rena took it, her gaze sharp. She missed nothing. She noticed the girl's pallor, the slight tremor in her hands. She saw the new, dark shadow behind her eyes. She didn't ask what was wrong. She waited. She knew that whatever Annin had found in the cellar, it would reveal itself in its own time. The truth, like a slow-acting poison, was now in their silent world, and she could only wait for the symptoms to appear. The frost was setting in. The knowledge of the locket lay like a shard of ice in Annen's chest. For weeks, she said nothing, did nothing. She moved through their shared routines with her usual quiet efficiency, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer a comfortable, shared space. It was a void, filled with the things she did not know and could not ask. Who was the woman with the fiery hair? Was she Annen's mother? And the man with her own eyes, who was he? Why did Rena keep his image hidden away like a painful treasure? Annen began to watch Rena with a new intensity. She studied the scar not with curiosity, but with a dawning, terrible understanding. She tried to imagine the violence that had carved such a mark. She tried to picture the man from the locket holding the knife. The image made her physically sick. Her loyalty, her love for the woman who had raised her was absolute. Rena was her sun, her moon, her entire world. But now, a terrible possibility had taken root in her mind, that the man who had hurt Rena was her own kin, that the blood of Rena's tormentor ran in her own veins. The winter came again, blanketing the mountains in a deep, muffling silence. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. It was during one of these long, dark evenings, with a blizzard howling outside, that the truth began to unravel. They were mending nets by the fire, their fingers moving in a familiar, hypnotic rhythm. For the first time in years, Annen felt the need for a word, a single word, to break the tension that had become unbearable. She held up the locket she had retrieved from the cellar again that afternoon. She had been carrying it in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder. She held it out to Rena on the palm of her hand. Rena stopped her work. Her hands, holding a wooden netting needle, went still. She looked at the locket, then at Annen's face. Her own expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. But Annen, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the subtle landscape of that face, saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a deep, ancient pain. Rena did not take the locket. She simply stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. Annen's voice, when it came, was a shock in the quiet room. It was husky from disuse, fragile as a dry leaf. Who? It was the only word she could manage. Rena closed her eyes for a long moment. The fire crackled in the hearth, the wind shrieked at the corners of the cabin. The sound of Annen's voice, after so many years of silence, seemed to hang in the air, a physical thing. When Rena opened her eyes again, they were filled with a bleakness that stole the breath from Annen's lungs. "His name is Kalen," Rena said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a voice for stating facts. "The woman is Lyra, your mother." Annen flinched as if struck. "Your mother." The words confirmed her deepest fear. She looked down at the beautiful, smiling woman in the locket, a mother she had never known. Then she looked at the man, Kalen, her father. "He gave you this," Annen whispered, her fingers tracing the scar on her own cheek, mirroring Rena's. It was not a question. Rena gave a short, sharp nod. "He did." "Why?" Annen's voice was stronger now, laced with a cold anger. Rena looked into the fire, her gaze distant, seeing not the flames, but a past that was always burning just behind her eyes. "Because I left him. Because I took something he believed was his." "What?" Annen pressed. "What did you take?" Rena's stone-gray eyes moved from the fire and settled on Annen. Her look was so intense, so full of a terrible unspoken truth, that Annen felt it like a brand. "You," Rena said, her voice a raw whisper. "I took you." The world tilted on its axis. Annen stared at her, uncomprehending. "Me? But you found me, at the trading post. They abandoned me." "He abandoned you," Rena corrected, her voice cold and precise. "He left you there to be found. He knew I traded there. He knew my routes. It was a message, a punishment, to show me that he could discard what I had risked everything to save, to show me that his daughter, that you, meant nothing to him beyond being a weapon to use against me. The pieces fell into place, sharp and cruel. The story Annin had built for herself of being an anonymous, discarded child found by a stranger was a lie. Her existence was not an accident. It was an act of vengeance. Her abandonment was a calculated move in a war she hadn't known she was a part of. "And my mother?" Annin's voice trembled. "Lyra?" "She died when you were born," Rena said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. "She was my sister." Sister. The word hung in the air. Jong-aya's a stone. The beautiful, smiling woman was not just Annin's mother, she was Rena's sister. The man, Kalen, had not just been Rena's tormentor. He had been her brother by law. The tangle of relationships was a knot of pain, of love and betrayal, so tightly wound it could never be undone. "We grew up together," Rena continued, her voice a low murmur. "Lyra was like the sun, and he, Kalen, was like a shadow that fell over her. He wanted her. He was a man of wealth and power, from a family that owned half the trade on the Howland River. He got what he wanted, always, but the light in her started to go out. When you were born, the last of her light went with you, and he blamed you. He hurt you because you took me from him?" "He hurt me because I wouldn't let him destroy you," Rena clarified. "After Lyra died, he saw you only as a reminder of his loss, a flawed copy of a perfection he could no longer possess. There was a cruelty in him. I saw what his grief was twisting into. I couldn't leave you there. So one night, I took you and ran. He caught up to us near the Blackwater marshes. He took you back, and he gave me this mark, so I would never forget who I had belonged to and what happened when I defied him." She paused, taking a breath. "I escaped. I came here, to the Spinebacks, where his reach was shorter. I built this life. I thought he would tire of his game. I thought perhaps he might even come to care for you. But Kalen does not care. He possesses. When he grew tired of the inconvenience of a child, he discarded you in the one place he knew I would eventually be. He left you on that floor to see if I would claim his refuse, to see if I still cared enough to pick up what he had thrown away." Annin looked from the locket to Rena's scarred face. The entire architecture of her life had been rebuilt in the span of a few minutes. She was not Annin, a name whispered from an old language. She had another name, a name tied to Kalen. She was the daughter of the man who had maimed the only mother she had ever known. She was the prize in a war she had never understood. "He won, then," Annin said, her voice hollow. "He made you take me. He made you care for me. His daughter." Rena reached out then, not to touch, but her hand hovered in the space between them, a rare gesture of connection. "He thinks he won," she said, and for the first time, a flicker of something like fire showed in the depths of her stone-gray eyes. "He thinks you are his to discard, and mine to be burdened with. He is wrong. You were never his. The moment I lifted you from that floor, you became mine, not by his design, but by my choice." The fierceness in Rena's voice was a shield. The possessive tenderness that had defined their lives was not a burden. It was a declaration of war. Annin closed her hand around the locket, the cold metal biting into her palm. She finally understood. Her life with Rena was not an accident of fate. It was an act of defiance. And the frost of the truth had not frozen her. It had tempered her. She was not just Annin, the girl from the woods. She was the daughter of Lyra, the sister of Rena. And she was the weapon that Kalen had thrown away, not realizing it would be picked up and aimed right back at him. The howling of the wind outside seemed to echo the storm that had just broken inside the cabin. The silence was over, and something was coming. The knowledge changed the texture of their days. The quiet routines remained, but now they were underscored by a new, shared purpose. Annin practiced with the bow Rena had made for her, not just to hunt for food, but with a cold, focused intensity. Every arrow that struck true was a silent answer to the man in the locket. She learned to track not just animals, but men. Rena taught her how to notice a boot print that was not a trapper's, how to distinguish the sound of a shod horse from a wild one. They were no longer just surviving, they were preparing. The name Kalen was never spoken again, but his presence was a constant shadow at the edge of their lives. He was the reason for the extra deadfall traps on the path to the cabin, the reason Rena now slept with a heavy axe by her cot instead of just on the wall. The love between them, once a silent, steady warmth, now had a sharp, dangerous edge. It was the love of soldiers in a foxhole, a bond forged not just in care, but in shared opposition to a common enemy. One day, in the early summer, 2 years after the revelation, a trader came up into the foothills. This was unusual. No one came this far up unless they were lost or desperate. He was a nervous man named Paris, with shifting eyes and a tremor in his hands. He said he was looking for rare mosses, but his gaze kept darting toward the tree line as if he expected to be ambushed. Rena met him on the path 100 yards from her cabin, a throwing knife held loosely in her hand. Annin watched from the cover of the trees, an arrow knocked in her bowstring. "This is not your territory, Paris," Rena said, her voice flat. I know, he stammered, holding up his hands. "A message, that's all. I was paid well." "From who?" "A man, a powerful man, from downriver, calls himself Kalen." The name dropped into the quiet air like a stone. Rena's expression did not change, but Annin saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. "He's looking for his daughter," Paris rushed on, eager to be done with his task. "He says she was taken from him years ago. He says he has reason to believe she's up here, in the Spinebacks. He's offering a reward, a fortune, enough to make a man rich for life." "And you came to warn me?" Rena's voice was laced with cold disbelief. Paris swallowed hard. "He's not a man to cross, Rena. But my wife's sister, she was one of his, for a time. I know what he is. He's not looking for a daughter. He's looking for property he misplaced. He's been asking questions at every post from here to the coast. He knows about a woman with a scar. He knows about a girl seen with her. It's only a matter of time." "Get off my mountain, Paris," Rena said. It was not a threat. It was a dismissal. The trader scrambled back down the path, casting frightened looks over his shoulder. Rena stood for a long time, staring down the empty trail. The wind sawed through the pines, a mournful sound. The inevitable had arrived. The shadow was no longer at the edge of their lives. It was falling directly over them. She turned and walked back to the cabin. Annin emerged from the woods to meet her. Their eyes met, and in that silent glance, everything was understood. The time for waiting was over. "He will not come alone," Rena stated, walking into the cabin. "He will bring men, armed. He will try to burn us out." Annin followed her. The fear she should have felt was absent, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. This was the moment her entire life had been leading toward. "We can't stay here." "No," Rena agreed. "To stay is to be trapped." She began to move, her actions swift and precise. She was not panicking. She was preparing for battle. She pulled a heavy oilskin satchel from under her cot. Inside were supplies she had been gathering for years: dried rations, a full water skin, fire starters, extra ammunition for the small, powerful crossbow she kept hidden, and several tightly bound packages. "There is a place," Rena said, her back to Annin as she worked. "A cave system high on the eastern ridge. The entrance is hidden behind a waterfall. We can hold out there for a month if we have to." "And then?" Annin asked, her own hands finding tasks, packing a smaller bag with medicinal herbs and bandages. Rena stopped and turned. She looked at Annin, her gaze hard and direct. "There is no and then. There is only this. He is coming for you. Not because he wants you, but because I have you. because your existence is my defiance. This ends when he is no longer a threat." The finality of her words hung in the air. This was not about escape. This was about eradication. "You have a choice," Rena said, her voice softer than Annin had ever heard it. "He is your father. His blood is in you. I can take you down to Greywater Crossing. I can leave you there. You can go to him. You can give him what he wants. He might let you live a life of comfort, a life with a name, a family, a life that isn't this." She gestured around the sparse cabin, at the tools and the traps and the hard, lonely life they represented. The offer was real. Annin could feel the weight of it. Rena was offering her an escape from the coming violence. She was offering her a chance at a different life, even if it was a life with the man who had caused all their pain. To Rena, safety might be worth that price. Safety for Annin. Annin looked at the woman who had lifted her from the filth and called her home. The woman who had washed her face, fed her, and taught her how to be strong. She looked at the scar, the mark of Kaelin's cruelty, and she felt not a connection to her father's blood, but a burning, righteous fury. Kaelin had tried to make her a weapon against Rena. He had failed. He had made her into Rena's weapon instead. "You said you claimed me," Annin said, her voice steady and clear. "Did you mean it?" Rena's eyes, the color of wet stone, held hers. "I did." "Then my place is with you," Annin said. She walked to the wall and took down her bow and a full quiver of arrows. "Let him come." A flicker of something fierce and proud lit Rena's face. It was not a smile, but it was more powerful than any smile Annin had ever seen. It was the look of a warrior who has found her shield maiden. It was the look of a mother who has been chosen back. They left the cabin at dusk, melting into the woods like ghosts. They left the door unbarred, a fire burning low in the hearth. It was an invitation, a trap. They moved silently and swiftly through the familiar forest, climbing higher into the rugged terrain of the Spinebacks. The moon was a sliver of silver in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees. From their vantage point, high on the ridge, they saw the torches a day later. A line of them, like a fiery serpent, winding its way up the mountain path. There were at least a dozen men, moving with the confidence of hunters who believe their prey is cornered. Annin's hand tightened on her bow. Rena laid a calming hand on her shoulder. "Not yet," she whispered, her breath a white plume in the cold air. "Patience. The mountain is our weapon. Let it do its work first." They watched as Kaelin's men reached the cabin. They saw the flicker of surprise as they found it empty, the door open. They saw a tall figure, silhouetted against the firelight from the doorway, step inside. Kaelin. Even from this distance, Annin could feel the arrogant certainty in his posture. He was not in the cabin for more than a minute when the explosion happened. Rena had packed the hearth with more than just logs. One of the tightly wrapped packages from her satchel contained a volatile mixture of pine pitch, sulfur, and ground charcoal. When the fire reached it, it erupted. The roof of the cabin blew upward in a shower of splintered wood and flame. A wave of force and sound rolled up the mountainside. Screams echoed in the night. "Now," Rena said. From the darkness, they became agents of chaos. Annin's arrows flew with deadly accuracy, finding the men who were momentarily silhouetted by the burning wreckage. Rena used the crossbow, its bolts heavy and powerful, punching through the leather armor of Kaelin's mercenaries. They did not attack from one place. They moved, silent as owls, using the terrain to their advantage. They would fire a volley from behind one rock outcropping, then melt back into the shadows and reappear 50 yards away, striking from a new angle. To the men below, it must have seemed as if the forest itself had come alive to kill them. They were disoriented, panicked, caught between the fire of the burning cabin and the unseen death that rained down from the darkness above. Kaelin was a survivor. Annin saw him rally his remaining men, pulling them back from the fire, forming a defensive circle. He was shouting orders, his voice carrying faintly on the wind. He was directing their fire toward the last place an arrow had come from. He was smart, and he was furious. The fight lasted for hours, a deadly dance of shadow and flame. Rena and Annin whittled down Kaelin's force, one man at a time. But Kaelin was relentless. He pushed his men forward, up the treacherous slope, using them as shields, forcing his way toward the ridge where he knew his quarry must be hiding. Finally, only Kaelin and two of his most hardened men remained. They were closing in on the waterfall that hid the cave entrance. The dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink. The coming light would expose them. "It is time," Rena said. Her face was grim, smudged with dirt and smoke. There was a shallow cut on her arm, but her eyes were bright with battle light. "You stay here. Keep them pinned. I will go around. Meet them from the side." "No," Annin said, her voice firm. "We do this together." Rena looked at her, at the young woman standing beside her, no longer a frightened child, but a warrior in her own right. She gave a single sharp nod. Together. They moved from the relative safety of their perch, down into a narrow ravine that would bring them out on the flank of Kaelin's approach. The final confrontation was at hand. They emerged from the ravine just as Kaelin and his men reached the pool at the base of the waterfall. He stood there, his fine clothes torn and blackened, his handsome face contorted with rage. He stared at the waterfall, knowing somehow that this was the place. "I know you're in there, Rena," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the rocks. "Send out my daughter. Send out what is mine, and I might let you live." From the rocks to his left, Rena stepped out. She held the heavy axe in her hands, its polished head gleaming in the dawn light. "She is not yours," she said, her voice calm and cold. Kaelin turned, a snarl on his lips. His two men raised their crossbows, but before they could fire, two arrows sprouted from their chests. They fell without a sound. Kaelin stared at them, then looked up into the rocks on the opposite side of the clearing. Annin stepped into view, another arrow already nocked, the bowstring drawn tight, aimed directly at his heart. Kaelin's eyes darted between the two of them, between the woman he had scarred and the daughter he had discarded. He saw not fear, but two faces carved from the same stone, two sets of eyes burning with the same cold fire. His arrogance finally faltered, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, and then fury. He laughed, a harsh grating sound. "So, the stray bitch taught my pup some tricks. You think this changes anything? You are my blood. You belong to me." He took a step toward Annin. "Stay where you are," Annin warned, her aim unwavering. "You won't kill your own father," he sneered, taking another step. "You are not my father," Annin said, her voice ringing with a clarity and power she had never known she possessed. "You are the man who hurt my mother." She used the word deliberately. Mother. And in her mind, she saw not the fiery-haired Lyra, but the stone-faced Rena. Kaelin's face darkened with rage. He drew his own sword, a fine, cruel-looking blade, and charged, not at Annin, with her ready arrow, but at Rena. He knew where the true wound was. Rena met his charge. The axe and the sword clashed, the ring of steel echoing through the clearing. They were a whirlwind of motion, a dance of death they had begun years ago. Kaelin was skilled, his swordsmanship born of wealth and training. But Rena fought with the raw, desperate fury of the wilderness itself. She fought not just for her life, but for the life she had built, for the child she had claimed. Annin watched, her heart pounding, the arrow still trained on the fight. She couldn't shoot. They were too close, moving too fast. A single mistake, and she could hit Rena. She was forced to be a spectator to the final, bloody settling of accounts. Kaelin was stronger, but Rena was faster. She moved like a cornered wolf, ducking under a wide swing of his sword, the blade shearing off a lock of her dark hair. She brought the butt of her axe handle up, catching him under the chin. He staggered back, blood flowing from his lip. He spat, his eyes burning with hate. He lunged again, his attack a frenzy of rage. He drove Rena back, step by step, until her back was against the cold, wet rock face beside the waterfall. He had her trapped. He raised his sword for a final killing blow. "She was mine!" he screamed, his face a mask of triumph. "Everything you have is mine!" Rena looked past him, her gaze locking with Annin's. In her eyes, there was no fear. There was only a command, a final lesson. Annin understood. She let her aim drop from Kalen's heart to his leg. She released the arrow. It flew true, sinking deep into his thigh. He roared in pain and surprise, his killing blow faltering. His balance was gone. He stumbled, his sword clattering against the rock. It was the only opening Rena needed. She did not hesitate. She swung the axe not in a wide arc, but in a short, brutal chop. It was not the blow of a warrior, but the efficient, practical motion of a woman who knew how to butcher a deer. The axe struck Kalen in the side of the neck, just above the collarbone. It was a mirror image of the scar he had given her. Blood erupted, a shocking, vibrant red against the gray rock. His eyes went wide with a final, uncomprehending shock. He made a gurgling sound and fell to his knees, his hands going to the wound. He looked at Rena, then at Annin, a question in his dying eyes. Then he pitched forward into the dirt and was still. The clearing was silent, save for the rush of the waterfall and the sound of their own harsh breathing. Rena stood over the body, the bloody axe held loosely in her hand. Her chest was heaving. Blood from Kalen's wound had sprayed across her face, mingling with the old silver scar. Annin lowered her bow, her body trembling with the aftermath of battle. She walked slowly toward Rena, her boots crunching on the gravelly soil. Rena did not look at her. She stared down at the man who had defined and damaged so much of her life. He was just a body now, a problem to be disposed of. The great, powerful Kalen, reduced to meat and bone. Annin stopped beside her. She looked at Rena, at the new blood on her face. Without thinking, she reached into her pouch for a clean piece of cloth, moistened it with water from her own skin, and began to gently wipe the blood from Rena's cheek, from her scar. Rena flinched at the touch, but she did not pull away. She stood perfectly still and let Annin clean her face. When she was done, Annin looked at the body on the ground. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet. Rena finally looked away from the body, her stone-gray eyes finding Annin's. "Now," she said, her voice rough. "We go home." She turned her back on the dead man and started walking away from the waterfall, back toward the smoldering ruin of the cabin that had been their sanctuary. She did not look back to see if Annin was following. She didn't need to. Annin watched her go for a moment. She looked at the body of her biological father, a man she had never known and would never mourn. She felt nothing for him. No grief, no connection. The only blood that mattered was the blood that had just been spilled to protect their shared life. The only name that mattered was the one she had been given by the silence and the forest. She was Annin. She was Rena's, and love had cost blood. Safety had cost a name that was never truly hers to begin with. She turned and followed Rena, walking into the light of the new day, leaving the shadows of the past behind them in a quiet, blood-soaked clearing high in the Spineback Mountains. Their steps were perfectly in sync,